Hi everyone. In this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about three different concepts that are pretty important for your job, but they're also very important if you take the certification test. And that's supply side versus demand side measures, short and long-term measures, and drought response versus water supply management. So supply side and demand side measures are pretty different. Supply side is the traditional response to meet increasing demand. A good example of this is that we live in Southern California, which is a very dry climate. So the people are here, so engineers are going to build big projects in Central and Northern California to move water to where we are. They're going to satisfy our demand by increasing supply. So that's kind of important to think about. Demand side is local. So that's why where we try to reduce water use at the source, at an individual's house. Now, the difference is kind of complicated in one way. Supply side is a lot more expensive. If you're going to build a dam, build conveyance, build treatment plants, that's very, very expensive. But it's in a lot of ways easier to manage than trying to get 30,000 different residences to reduce demand. It's one big problem versus 30,000. Even though the expense is much higher in supply side, often people don't look at the dramatically reduced expense of using demand side measures. So when you're looking at a demand side response, you have to look beyond the meter. Traditionally, water companies only look up to the meter, and then what happens with the water once it's on their property or an individual's property is no longer of any importance to them. In the last 10, 15 years, there's been some planning efforts, and they're called IRPs, Integrated Regional Plans. And they look at both reducing demand and increasing supply to meet a growing population. Sometimes they're called Integrated Regional Management Plans, IRMPs, but they're still the same thing. IRP is the more common term. So this little graphic kind of shows you a little bit better of the difference between demand side and supply side. This was a difficult concept for me. So supply side is everything coming from the treatment plant, from dams, from up north, from wherever you're getting water, up into the meter, which is represented by the black box in the middle of the line. Everything past the meter is the demand side. So we look at reducing demand to meet supply rather than increasing supply to meet demand. So this is about short and long-term measures, which essentially is drought response versus water supply management. And that too is a little bit different concept to think about. Short term, we're talking about droughts and emergencies. An emergency might be an earthquake. That's the one that we prepare for most frequently. Or maybe a catastrophic fire. Up north a couple years ago, they had a lot of fires, and the fires were so hot that they burned all the pipeline in the ground. So that is still a short-term emergency until new pipe is laid, but it was a pretty dramatic one. In short-term issues, you need a water shortage contingency plan. Everybody has one already because it's a requirement of the Urban Water Management Plan that is published every 5 years. Now, it's going to be changing in 2020 a little bit, but how they work generally is by percentage. So 10% would be a 10% reduction, 20 would be a 20% reduction, 30 and so on. And the only time you're going to go to an immediate jump from like 0 to 50 or 60% is in that emergency situation like an earthquake or a fire. Normally, in a drought, it's ramped up over time. So you start at 10, then if it continues, you go to 20, then you go to 30. That's the way that works. Usually, the water shortage contingency plan located in the Urban Water Management Plan is backed up by an ordinance within your entity. So your council or your board will have voted on the water shortage contingency plan outside of the Urban Water Management Plan. And there's usually restrictions and often there's penalties, but they're always designed to be temporary. We hope that when you have a major emergency or a drought, it's not going to last forever. So even though it might be 3 or 4 years, it's still a temporary issue. Now, more important probably, as long as you have short-term measures in place, is your long-term or your permanent demand reduction. And that's going to require a multi-year commitment from your suppliers and your agency generally. So in a multi-year program or a permanent demand reduction, you might have a landscape program, and it's going to go for more than 1 year. Shoot, just to work on it and get it really rolling, it's going to take you 6 months to a year. So you don't want to cut it off after a year. You want to run it as long as you can, as long as it's realistic. You might need a multi-year commitment on that from a vendor. Let's say you were running a washing machine replacement program, and you were going to replace everybody's washing machine within your service area. Well, you want to lock that in at a good price, and obviously it's going to take you 3 to 5 years to do it. So if you lock your supplier for washing machines in at a good price in year 1, then you're going to continue to pay that good price in year 2, 3, or whatever the length of your program is. So almost always permanent demand reduction programs have multi-year commitments, not only by the agency, but by vendors. They always target efficiency. As in the washing machine example, you want to use a more efficient washing machine. So that's the easiest way, but even a landscape program could be targeting efficiency, because once it's done, it often is going to become efficient over time. We said focus on hardware. In this case, you can consider landscapes as hardware, and the savings are over time. You may not get a huge bang for your buck immediately, but you will over the long term. Whereas in a quick drought response plan, you're looking at saving water immediately and lots of it. Maybe it's an earthquake and you need to save 60% of your water because you just don't have enough. You need that today versus a long-term plan where you're going to look at it over a long period of time. All right, so these are some examples of drought response versus water supply management. In the short term, you can immediately restrict watering days and times. Most drought contingency plans do that. They set up penalties for waste of water, but also penalties if you're violating any part of the drought contingency plan. And they may go as far as basic water rationing. And you might need that in the case of an earthquake, for example. But long ones are going to go focus on hardware and efficiency and behavioral change. That's particularly true in landscape conversions. You're going to get people to change their entire landscape aesthetic. That is a behavioral change.